Something has just come out that was never meant to be seen by the public. It was buried inside classified briefings, locked inside secure intelligence systems, and kept far away from public view until tonight. U.S. intelligence has now revealed Russia's next military move. And this was not an accident. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate decision. This was not an attack with missiles or troops. This was an attack with information, and what was revealed has already triggered emergency meetings across NATO. Ukrainian forces have been placed on high alert, and Vladimir Putin has been pushed into a situation he did not expect. Here is what just happened. Washington detected Russia preparing something major, something imminent, something dangerous enough that staying silent was no longer an option. So U.S. officials broke protocol. They exposed the plan before it could happen. Now Russia faces a critical choice. Move forward knowing the entire world is watching, or pull back and risk looking weak. Stay with me. Because what comes next shows how intelligence itself has become one of the most powerful weapons in this war. Now let me explain why this moment is different. Intelligence leaks are not new. We have seen them before, but this was not a typical leak. Officials are calling this a deliberate exposure. A calculated decision to sacrifice intelligence in order to disrupt a military operation already in motion. According to multiple sources, U.S. intelligence uncovered a coordinated Russian operation that goes far beyond normal security, that push far normal battlefield activity. Missile systems were moving into launch-ready positions. Air defense units were being repositioned to protect strike routes. Cyber teams were ramping up attacks on infrastructure far from the front lines. All of this was happening under the cover of routine military exercises. On their own, none of these moves would raise alarms. But when analysts put the full picture together, the pattern was unmistakable. What forced Washington to act was timing. Intelligence showed key parts of this plan could be activated within days, not weeks. That narrow window triggered emergency discussions inside the White House, the Pentagon, and NATO headquarters. And it led to a rare decision: expose the plan before it unfolds. If this already goes deeper than what you hear in mainstream news, subscribe now. We go beyond the headlines every single day. This is no longer about slowly gaining territory. This is about shock, confusion, and leverage. U.S. intelligence officials say Russia has been preparing a multi-domain assault, land, air, and cyberspace, all striking at the same time. The objective is not size. The objective is simultaneity. Overwhelm Ukrainian defenses by hitting everywhere at once. Here is how the plan was designed to work. Phase 1. Missile strikes force air defense systems to activate and draw attention to the skies. Phase 2. While focus remains on incoming missiles, cyber operations hit energy grids and communication networks. Command and control is disrupted at the moment it is needed most. Phase 3. Russian air operations exploit the chaos, testing Ukrainian response times and watching NATO reactions while coordination breaks down. This is not new for Russia. This is a playbook refined through years of exercises, a playbook rehearsed quietly, a playbook that until now remained hidden, But here is the strategic impact of what Washington just did. By exposing the plan early, the most powerful Russian advantage was removed. Surprise, when operations stay in the shadows, control remains intact. Once exposed, that control disappears, right? That is the pressure Moscow is facing right now. One senior U.S. official described it clearly. This operation is preventable if exposed early, but destabilizing if allowed to unfold. Right? That single statement explains why this exposure happened. The response was immediate. NATO allies were briefed within hours. European governments raised alert levels. Ukraine did not wait for public confirmation. They moved immediately. I know Satellite data shows Ukrainian forces adjusting positions across multiple regions. Air defense coverage expanded. Surveillance patterns shifted. Cyber defense units moved to full readiness. These are not dramatic gestures. These are calculated adjustments guided by intelligence. Adjustments designed to stop an attack before it delivers impact. NATO is moving with caution, and intelligence sharing has intensified. Monitoring along the eastern flank has increased. Alliance leaders are balancing deterrence without triggering escalation. Inside Russia, the public response was dismissive. State media labeled the exposure as Western propaganda. But intelligence intercepts reveal a different reality. Russian military channels shifted into higher security modes immediately after the information went public. Communication procedures changed. Unit movement schedules were altered. Analysts say this reaction confirms Moscow understands its operational security has been compromised. And when a military loses surprise, it loses confidence. Now, here's the dilemma Vladimir Putin is facing. Option one, proceed with the operation as planned. But now every move is being watched. Ukraine and its partners are prepared to counter in real time. Surprise is gone. Failure becomes a real risk. And failure under global attention is humiliation. Option two, delay the operation or change it. But that sends a different message. It signals weakness. It tells Russian commanders that Western intelligence can disrupt plans before they begin. It tells domestic audiences that Putin is not as untouchable as state media claims. Neither option is clean. Neither option is safe. Both carry consequences far beyond the battlefield. Putin has built his image on control, precision, and unpredictability. Exposure undermines that image. It forces explanations, it invites scrutiny, and it removes flexibility. One intelligence analyst described it this way: when surprise disappears, pressure replaces confidence. And pressure is exactly what is building inside Russia's command structure. This is what intelligence warfare looks like today. Information is no longer just collected, it is weaponized. It is used to shape the battlefield before the first strike ever happens. Now think about why this moment matters so much. For months, Russia has operated in ambiguity. Launch attacks, then deny responsibility. Threaten escalation, then claim provocation. Delay acknowledgement to maintain advantage. This exposure destroys that strategy. Russian intentions are now visible. Actions are placed under scrutiny before they happen. And that alone changes the dynamics of the war. Intelligence is no longer only used behind closed doors. It is now a tool of deterrence, a way to influence behavior before decisions turn into action. U.S. officials say this choice was not made lightly. Exposing intelligence carries serious risk. Methods can be revealed. Sources can be compromised. But officials argue silence carried the greater danger. Allowing a major escalation without warning could have dragged multiple actors into a crisis with no room to slow things down. By exposing the plan, early Washington believes it reduced the risk of miscalculation. Even if tension rises in the short term, this is the new battlefield, not just missiles, tanks, or troops, But information exposure, psychological pressure, and strategic visibility, Russia is now. So where does this go next? Right now, intelligence agencies across Europe are watching Russian movements in real time, Satellites remain locked on key regions. Cyber teams are on high alert. Ukrainian forces are preparing for scenarios that until yesterday existed only on paper. This exposure has sped up the clock, but it has also limited Russia's choices. What happens next depends entirely on how Moscow responds to being exposed. Do they push forward despite global scrutiny, or do they pause, recalibrate, and wait for attention to fade?
Yeah.
Both paths are risky. Both could shape the next stage of this war. History shows that what happens between warning and action often determines what comes next. You know? And right now we are inside that window. This is no longer just about what Russia intends to do. It is a test of whether exposure can prevent escalation, a test of whether intelligence can deter action, a test of whether transparency can buy time in a conflict driven by risk. That test is happening right now. One thing is undeniable. This exposure has changed the calculus. The balance has shifted from surprise to visibility, from ambiguity to accountability. No matter what Russia does next, the world will be watching. Its next move will not happen in silence. This is modern warfare. Not just tanks and missiles, but intelligence operations designed to remove an enemy's greatest advantage. The ability to act without warning. Washington has shown that exposing a plan before it happens forces an opponent to operate under the worst conditions possible.
Yeah.
Constant scrutiny. For Vladimir Putin, a leader who has relied on secrecy, narrative control, and the image of invincibility. That scrutiny is deeply dangerous, right? Because when the perception of control breaks, everything else begins to crack. This is the reality of the moment. The leak has reshaped the battlefield, not with weapons, but with exposure. Whether Russia advances or pauses, the outcome has already changed. Surprise is gone. Control is weakened. This is no longer a hidden conflict operating in shadows. This is a confrontation unfolding under global observation. Every move Moscow makes will now be measured, analyzed, and anticipated. That alone limits power. This is what modern warfare has become. Intelligence is not just protection. It is pressure. It is used to force decisions, to create hesitation, to expose vulnerability before action. Washington has demonstrated that revealing a plan before it begins can disrupt an operation without firing a single shot. It forces the opponent to fight under disadvantage, and that disadvantage is visibility. For Vladimir Putin, a leader shaped by secrecy, timing, and narrative dominance, being exposed is not just inconvenient. It is destabilizing. It fractures the illusion of control, it invites doubt, and it weakens authority. Because once the myth of total control starts to crack, everything built on top of it becomes fragile. This is why this moment matters. Not because of what has already happened, but because of what may now never happen. This is the space between warning and action, where outcomes are decided. And right now, the world is watching what Russia does next. This level of analysis is not found in short headline clips. Nope. If you want deep, clear breakdowns like this every day, subscribe and turn on notifications. Watch the next video on screen where we explain NATO's emergency response strategy. I will see you there.